what are we doing and what's next? You know, we're trying to pull you in, as we mentioned before, to provide those thoughts, the recommendation, and the thought process behind what do these mean in the real world. You know, so that's what you're doing here. And you see here, we've had a few meetings. You know, August 10th, we've got this one. You've got coming up the facilities tour. Then we're going to talk about the different components. So you see each of these that are laid out here, cost to recover, then cost of service review of water and electric side, and then rate recommendations. Those are all pieces of this process, all pieces of the study, if you would. So as we model these and as we get these answers, we're giving you the answers. Get thoughts on that, and then we'll move to the next step, because we don't want to go through and finish the whole thing and then come back and throw it all out there at you. So we're feeding this actually in the same time frame as we're working with MBU. So here, this may probably easier to read on your sheet there. This is just basically big picture. This is the process and what we're doing. So we break it up into 4 steps. So what kind of dollars can we, you know, from a customer standpoint, we have a certain number of customers on the system. We project a certain number of customers on the system. So what kind of revenue under current rates, what kind of revenue do we expect to recover this year, projected out for the next 3 years? And then what kind of dollars does it take to run the system? So once we get those two, we've got the dollars we expect now under current rates, and we have the dollars we expect to run the system. And then we'll talk about how should we, you know, who's using those dollars, how are they spending those dollars, that's customer classes, and then how do we recover it? So we have an answer. There's a few different ways to actually apply that answer. So big picture, that's what we're doing. And really today, we're just gonna look at the first part of it, those customers, and then the revenue requirements are what kind of dollars do we expect, what's it gonna cost to run it. So that's what we'll talk about here quickly, and then that'll be the next meeting, actually. Those will start talking about actual answers on this one. So we expect basically to recover the money sufficient to run our system. So we can cut costs, we can run it as efficiently as possible, but at the end of the day, it's gonna take X dollars to run the system. So really what we'll do, we'll take the customers, we'll project out those customers, and we'll apply your rates to their usage. So that gives us the dollars to run the system. Here, just talking about, and we've laid out to give you an idea from a number of customers, and then the consumption, what they use, and then the revenue they produce, to give you an idea of what this means. And you see here we've got residential, irrigation, your multi-use commercial, and then other services there. And by far, from a customer account, you know, your residential carries the load here as far as number of customers on your system. Not surprisingly, they use most of it. So it just falls right in place there. Now, however, most customers expect the most consumption, most usage on the system, but from a revenue standpoint, this is where you start looking at what kind of impact do they have on the system. How do they use the system? How do they operate the system? And you notice the way then we're priced here, actually commercial starts, or irrigation starts coming up. Irrigation is one where, from a standpoint of residential, that's where you start sending pricing signals. And thus, you know, the way the dollars show. Yes, sir. Yes, John.
Is that irrigation customers, is that mutually exclusive of residential or commercial customers?
That is. They'll have irrigation customers that have a separate meter that we can actually meter irrigation.
Okay, so irrigation's metered separately.
Yes, sir. In the cases where they do have a separate meter. Not always. Sometimes you're just out watering your lawn, or you have it all the same thing, but you actually have to, there's a process for getting a separate meter.
By ordinance, 2007 was the first year that an irrigation meter was required for somebody putting in an irrigation system. So every home that had an irrigation system prior to 07, if they have an irrigation system, it's in the residential class. So unfortunately, us and the rest of water utilities in the country just don't have visibility to it. So when you see irrigation, that's just the irrigation meters from 2007 until now. It's important. It's a very important question you're asking as we get into rates, because it's the irrigation volumes that drive the need for investments in water supply and infrastructure.
Interesting. interesting. And then, so from a total customer perspective, you could just kind of eliminate the irrigation, your county customers.
Yes.
Is there a way to transition?
To get to require irrigation meters for where they are now. The challenge with that is the plumbing required. I mean, we could go out and set in all the houses, right? That's something that we can do. Challenge is getting the private plumbing from where they're currently tied into their service in the yard, running all the way up to where the irrigation meter would be. I mean, if you're in the data analysis, I mean, I kind of like that kind of stuff. It would be really nice to have, but it costs prohibitive. Because that cost would have to be borne by the customer. If not, then the utility would pay for it. We have to spread that across all customers.
But are you now or in the future like you know the average use of water that a household would use. So is there a tiered system based on the residential number where you do capture a lot of those irrigation dollars that otherwise would be classified in irrigation?
It's a great question. Yes. So one of the things that we want to try to accomplish as we go through this rate design is identify what is the volume these days that is non-irrigation within the residential class. Because you have, the way the rates are designed right now, it's designed such that whether a residential customer, whether they have an irrigation meter or not, they're paying the same. And you'll see when we get into how that tier, you asked a question, yes, it's tiered. So the more you use, the higher per gallon it is. They're designed right now so it doesn't matter whether you have an irrigation meter or not. But these tiers have been in place for many, many years. So tier 1 threshold is 7,500 gallons, but it's annually because of all the low flow fixtures that are put in place through ordinance, and your sink goes out, you get a new one, that kind of thing. The number these days is around 6,000 gallons with no irrigation, and beyond that it's typically irrigation. So that's something that we need to look at. Is what are those tiers? Do we have enough of them? Are they the right places?
Because you're hitting the right questions, absolutely hitting them, because when we go through it, like Ian mentioned, that number from 7,500 down to 6,000 is very important, because the goal on this, when you're designing these rates and putting this together, you don't want to penalize people for just washing clothes, doing their dishes, cooking supper, taking baths, that type of thing. You don't want to penalize them there. You don't want to force them to make a decision. Do I bathe this week or do I not bathe this week? So that's why you want to hit those tiers right and price them accordingly. Then when you get to the outer ones where you're going, okay, this is irrigation, you have a choice now. How green do you want your lawn? Or then we're in situations as we move it into to where from a supply standpoint, we're starting to feel the pressure as we use water at these levels. We want to pass that along and give pricing signals to help us out from the standpoint, okay, we're in a drought condition. So we need to use less. Those type of things, those decisions that you make when you're pricing this. And then from a water standpoint, the irrigation, think of it from the flip side. So when you have the irrigation identified, irrigation doesn't go back into your sewer system. So from a residential customer standpoint, you really would have liked that identified, because that means, okay, this water usage is just water usage. I'm not going to pay for any part of that in my sewer bill. So that's what makes that nice as well, when you can identify.
And this is a lot, I'm sorry. As Ian was saying, it's so physically the electrons, whether we own the rights to them or not, are all going in the pool, and then ERCOT's using the transmission system to spread them out throughout the state. Financially, we own the financial contractual rights to that energy, and so there's financial tracking of everything that moves outside of ERCOT. And so that moves between us and whoever our counterparty is that we've signed the contract with. Other questions? Okay. We've already talked about this. This is again the percent renewable that MDU's portfolio currently is. Looking at distributed energy resources, Tony already mentioned this a little bit. Distributed energy resources are types of generation that are now no longer just a massive wind farm, solar farm, or a massive power plant. These are now distributed within distribution systems. They can be residential solar, they can be generators of a business, they can be battery banks in a home or a business. We are seeing massive growth in the industry as a whole in this realm. It's going to continue to change the landscape of electric utilities across the world as the technologies improve and continue to grow. 10 years ago, people would have told you solar's not there yet. Solar's there today. I mean, you guys see it pretty much every time you probably drive home. If you look up at the roofs of the neighborhood you're driving through, it's coming, it's growing every year. I think our next, no, well, 2 slides forward, speaks to just the growth of solar installations even here locally. It's basically been doubling every single year. As a utility, we actually don't discourage this. We're one of the few companies or things that sells a product where we actually constantly encourage people to use less of our product, which is unique. DERs are coming. Again, battery banks in the homes, solar's on home. Wind, it's not really feasible here. It's not windy enough, often enough to really make it feasible for homeowners or businesses to install wind generation. And this is just the start. I'm sure somebody's going to invent something else that will be new and cool and coming and will change the industry even more as we continue to move forward. What we as an industry have to start preparing for is really how does the flow of two-way energy work? The distribution system was designed, the transmission system was designed for one way. And so now we have to plan around how are we going to do a two-way system? How are we going to take generation back from the customers, make sure that they're getting compensated accordingly, but also at the same time maintain the safety of our people who have to be out on the lines and out in the field working those lines to know that their safety is ensured. It's something that we're working through as an industry. Tony, you want to speak to this one? Okay. This is looking at the area growth and the PUC. Again, this is just speaking to how disruptive it's going to be in the field as we start moving forward. We've already talked about the residential growth and the customer counts who are installing solar. It's growing like crazy year over year. This is just another view of it. This is battery installations. This is just another form of DER that is continuing to grow and expand. This really wasn't a thing up until recent years. Notice the date chart on there starts in 21. And it's growing like crazy. As these become more and more affordable, as battery technologies begin to shift, this is going to play a bigger and bigger role in the utility industry. It's also going to play a larger role at the utility scale size. And so there are already examples of test cases out in ERCOT where they have installed large capacity battery farms, for lack of a better word, upwards of 50 to 25 megawatts. And so what we are going to see as we keep moving forward in time is more and more of these large scale installations coming into the market. And they might even be in our backyard.
From a policy perspective,
Sure.
does NBU have policies in place?
That is a great question.
Consumers,
What was the whole question? Policy in place?
if y'all have the policies in place that enable residents to
interconnect.
solar panels.
Yes.
Can I talk a little bit about that? That's kind of a high-level priority for the organization. The answer is yes, but we're inconvenient. We haven't had the resources internally to really build out a distributed energy resources program for our customers. It's been convenient, and we haven't been able to provide the solutions that our customers have been asking for. And the reason we haven't been able to do that is because with the growth that we've had in New Braunfels, we've had to add employees where the need was. So there's just such a demand on our workforce to keep up with growth, with the number of new customers calling customer service and the crews that we need to put in operations. We simply haven't been able to dedicate resources up until now to actually build out policies and programs and incentives for this. So the Board of Trustees approved a position last year, and we hired and filled that position almost a year ago. And it's exciting. So this person is building out these programs. Right now, I'll be honest with you, we have a reputation among solar and battery installers as being inflexible and difficult to deal with. And I'm not going to disagree. And the reason that it's been that way is because and the lack of a resource being able to actually manage that and build some type of strategic program around that, what we've had to fall back on are simple, just plain old engineering specifications. How do we just put something in place to protect our folks when they're out working on the system? But the opportunities there are, and I think Tony's probably gonna talk about this, if you have enough of these distributed energy resources, you can leverage that and make that part of your power supply program. It's a resource for you. So when prices go high, in ERCOT, if you have all these distributed energy resources, they can provide for the grid in New Braunfels at hopefully a lot cheaper price. And if it's not cheaper, at least you can come up with incentives and design intentional, specific incentives for people putting these types of resources at their house, so that it does help the overall cost for the consumer, the customer in New Braunfels. Same thing with electric vehicles. We're behind on electric vehicles, and this person's responsibility, their role is to also build out programs around that because they're coming. We've all seen what the auto manufacturers make, and I don't care if you like EVs or it's become this ideological argument in this country. It doesn't matter, they're coming, right? Auto manufacturers have laid down their forecasts, and we need to be ready for it.
Other questions? Before I step back for my final time. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, David, Ian, Tony, appreciate it. Now we're gonna move into more of the what are we trying to accomplish with this whole thing? Why we're here, what are we doing today, what are we doing for the next few months? So the goal of this is really, from an MBU standpoint, provide a safe, reliable, efficient service, water, wastewater, electric service, okay? So it's somewhat like your home. All the costs that go into that, your debt service, mortgage, car payments, that type of thing, electric costs, repair people out to your house, water costs, those type of things, but expanded by 1,000 or more. So everything that goes into operating the utility, projecting out, and for this case too, we'll be projecting out 3 years from a service standpoint, what's it gonna take? So that's what we're trying to accomplish here. Everything that goes into that, what are the costs, and how do we pass those costs along to provide the service? So that's the goal here when we finish this process. Part of it, we talk about, and it's brought up here, the cost will vary. The cost for the system is one thing, but then how do we spread that among customers? And what happens there? Because every customer impacts the system. Every customer class impacts the system differently. So a residential customer and a commercial customer impact the system differently. They use the system differently. Some are more efficient in the way they use it. So we take all those things into account when we're trying to figure out how do we price this, how do we cost this, and actually recover the dollars to provide the service. What are we doing and what's next? You know, we're trying to pull you in, as we mentioned before, to provide those thoughts, the recommendation, and the thought process behind what do these mean in the real world. You know, so that's what you're doing here. And you see here, we've had a few meetings. You know, August 10th, we've got this one. You've got coming up the facilities tour. Then we're going to talk about the different components. So you see each of these that are laid out here, cost to recover, then cost of service review of water and electric side, and then rate recommendations. Those are all pieces of this process, all pieces of the study, if you would. So as we model these and then as we get these answers, we're giving you the answers, get thoughts on that, and then we'll move to the next step, because we don't want to go through and finish the whole thing and then come back and throw it all out there at you. So we're feeding this actually in the same time frame as we're working with MBU. So here, this may probably easier to read on your sheet there. This is just basically big picture. This is the process and what we're doing. So we break it up into 4 steps. So what kind of dollars can we, you know, from a customer standpoint, we have a certain number of customers on the system. We project a certain number of customers on the system. So what kind of revenue under current rates, what kind of revenue do we expect to recover this year, projected out for the next 3 years? And then what kind of dollars does it take to run the system? So once we get those two, we've got the dollars we expect now under current rates, and we have the dollars we expect to run the system. And then we'll talk about how should we, you know, who's using those dollars, how are they spending those dollars, that's customer classes, and then how do we recover it? So we have an answer. There's a few different ways to actually apply that answer. So big picture, that's what we're doing. And really today, we're just gonna look at the first part of it, those customers, and then the revenue requirements are what kind of dollars do we expect, what's it gonna cost to run it. So that's what we'll talk about here quickly, and then that'll be the next meeting, actually. Those we'll start talking about actual answers on this one. So, we expect basically to recover the money sufficient to run our system. So, we can cut costs, we can run it as efficiently as possible, but at the end of the day, it's gonna take X dollars to run the system. So really what we'll do, we'll take the customers, we'll project out those customers, and we'll apply your rates to their usage. So that gives us the dollars to run the system. Here, just talking about, and we've laid out to give you an idea from a number of customers, and then the consumption, what they use, and then the revenue they produce, to give you an idea of what this means. And you see here we've got residential, irrigation, your multi-use commercial, and then other services there. And by far, from a customer account, you know, your residential carries the load here as far as number of customers on your system. Not surprisingly, they use most of it. So it just falls right in place there. Now, however, most customers expect the most consumption, most usage on the system. But from a revenue standpoint, this is where you start looking at what kind of impact do they have on the system. How do they use the system? How do they operate the system? And you notice the way then we're priced here, actually commercial starts, or irrigation starts coming up. Irrigation is one where, from a standpoint of residential, that's where you start sending pricing signals. And thus, you know, the way the dollars show. Yes, sir. Yes, John.
Is that irrigation customers, is that mutually exclusive of residential or commercial customers?
That is. They'll have irrigation customers that have a separate meter that we can actually meter irrigation.
Okay, so irrigation's metered separately.
Yes, sir. In the cases where they do have a separate meter. Not always. Sometimes you're just out watering your lawn, or you have it all the same thing, but you actually have to, there's a process for getting a separate meter.
By ordinance, 2007 was the first year that an irrigation meter was required for somebody putting in an irrigation system. So every home that had an irrigation system prior to 07, if they have an irrigation system, it's in the residential class. So unfortunately, us and the rest of water utilities in the country just don't have visibility to it. So when you see irrigation, that's just the irrigation meters from 2007 until now. It's important. It's a very important question you're asking as we get into rates, because it's the irrigation volumes that drive the need for investments in water supply and infrastructure.
Interesting. And then, so from a total customer perspective, you can just kind of eliminate the irrigation, your county customers.
Yes.
Is there a way to transition?
To get to require irrigation meters for where they are now.
Yeah.
The challenge with that is the plumbing required. I mean, we could go out and set them in all the houses, right? That's something that we can do. Challenge is getting the private plumbing from where they're currently tied into their service in the yard, running all the way up to where the irrigation meter would be. I mean, if you're in the data analysis, I mean, I kind of like that kind of stuff. It would be really nice to have the cost prohibitive, because that cost would have to be borne by the customer. If not, then the utility would pay for it and spread that across all customers.
But are you now or in the future cash, like you know the average use of water that a household would use. So is there a tiered system based on the residential number where you do capture a lot of those irrigation dollars that otherwise would be classified in irrigation?
It's a great question. Yes. So one of the things that we want to try to accomplish as we go through this rate design is identify what is the volume these days that is non-irrigation within the residential class. Because you have, the way the rates are designed right now, it's designed such that whether a residential customer, whether they have an irrigation meter or not, they're paying the same. And you'll see when we get into how that tier, you asked a question, yes, it's tiered. So the more you use, the higher per gallon it is. They're designed right now so it doesn't matter whether you have an irrigation meter or not. But these tiers have been in place for many, many years. So tier 1 threshold is 7,500 gallons, but it's annually because of all the low flow fixtures that have been put in place through ordinance, and your sink goes out, you get a new one, that kind of thing. The number these days is around 6,000 gallons with no irrigation. Then beyond that, it's typically irrigation. irrigation. So that's something that we need to look at, is what are those tiers? Do we have enough of them? Are they in the right places?
Because you're hitting the right questions, absolutely hitting them, because when we go through it, like Ian mentioned, you know, that number from 7,500 down to 6,000 is very important, because the goal on this, when you're designing these rates and putting this together, you don't want to penalize people for just washing clothes, doing their dishes, cooking supper, taking baths, that type of thing. You don't want to penalize them there. You don't want to force them to make a decision. Do I bathe this week or do I not bathe this week? So that's why you want to hit those tiers right and price them accordingly. Then when you get to the outer ones where you're going, okay, this is irrigation, you have a choice now. How green do you want your lawn? Or then we're in situations as we move it into to where from a supply standpoint, we're starting to feel the pressure as we use water at these levels. We want to pass that along to give pricing signals to help us out from the standpoint, okay, we're in a drought condition. So we need to use less, those type of things, those decisions that you make when you're pricing this. And then from a water standpoint, the irrigation, think of it from the flip side. So when you have the irrigation identified, irrigation doesn't go back into your sewer system. So from a residential customer standpoint, you really would have liked that identified, because that means, okay, this water usage is just water usage. I'm not gonna pay for any part of that in my sewer bill. So that's what makes that nice as well, when you can identify.
I think Bobby did too, but,
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. On new construction, since we're targeting so much new construction, irrigation, are we finding ways to incentivize builders to find ways to put in smaller areas that irrigation is not gonna be a possibility?
Yeah, the answer to the question is, there's not a big effort on that right now. I'll go back to that slide I mentioned earlier, that one water work that we're doing. That's exactly where we want to head, is put incentives in place, because I'm holding back from the slides, but I showed you early on that first water slide was, here's how much water we have, and here's the demand, right? Half of the demand, roughly, every single year is irrigation. Half of it, right? So that's water we have to buy, we have to treat, we have to pump, we have to store, all of that. So there is a financial impact of how much water folks are using. So long term, and we hear that from developers from time to time. In fact, when we serve a development outside of our water territory, because we have the water to do that, we serve by contract. So we purposely have not expanded our service territory, because if it's in our territory, we must serve. By keeping it smaller, if someone wants to gain water service from us outside of our territory, we'll do it by contract. And the reason we do that is because there's an opportunity to put conservation measures in there that we can't do inside city limits. And so, yes, absolutely, long term, that's where we want to go. We do that a lot. Actually, talking on and on, I'll leave there.
Ian?
that was two-part. Do we know what percentage of the households in the service area have the water meters? Do we have any idea about that?
Not off the top of my head, but we'll take note of that.
Okay, and then the second part of that, I think we already talked about the orange piece is just what we're measuring off of those meters. So we can reasonably achieve, get to the point that, that's probably average for the rest of the community. Is that how we're basing that?
I think you can pretty easily, if you're looking at it system-wide, right, you can pretty easily estimate what is the domestic use versus the irrigation if they don't have irrigation. It's pretty consistent. It's not perfect all the time. In fact, I'll tell you that sometimes you'll have feedback from customers that say, I have two families living in my house, okay? We're using more than 6,000 gallons, but I'm hitting it, or 7,500 right now. I'm over 7,500, I'm not irrigating, but I'm having to pay the irrigation loan. And I understand that. It's a legitimate question to ask. The question, as you make rates though, and for this committee, is what do you do about that? I mean, do you have a rate that's based on how many people are in a particular home? And if so, we administer a program like that. So those are something we do with those kinds of questions.
Thank you. Okay. Here on the next slide, all this is American giving you what we just looked at on the graphs. there. So just, so you have a better idea of comparisons. We have the actual amounts, and then you can look across your percentages to compare, split up in the, basically the yellow, light blue, and the green, just to give you an idea from the customer classes and accounts, the revenue and consumption. So the same thing on the sewer side, we took that out, broke it to customer accounts, the consumption and the revenue, the usage of revenue. So this is residential, multi-unit, and commercial. By far, residential carries the day on the number of accounts we use. We carry the consumption, same thing, and just like you would expect. Commercial picking up a little bit, but the main revenue on the system from the sewer side also comes from the residential customer. So we look at the same thing from water and sewer. And then the next slide, same thing. It's just all the information that you just looked at, put in one spot. Yes, sir, Dustin?
Before we go into the largest water customers by usage, I just wanted to offer if anybody needed a break, does anybody on the committee need a break? Yes. Okay, so can we take like a 5-minute break, just real quick?
Sure, absolutely, yes, sir. Let you look at, where you have your breakup and your makeup on your residential, commercial, irrigation, how your customers, on the system layout, kind of revenues they produce, who uses what, give you an idea there. Now in the next couple of slides, we're actually gonna look at who your largest users, your top 10 largest users for 2020 and 21, both on the water and the sewer side. So won't read all these out to you. One thing I will note that on Sundance there, you'll notice they are a reuse customer, and they're also the largest water user. I said, won't read those to you. Just want to have you get an idea of who's using what on the system. Here, same thing on the sewer side from the 2020 and 2021. Top 10 sewer users there. And then we'll move in actually to the electric side of it.
Thanks, Rich. We've got a little bit of a similar story, but a little different on electric as far as water. We'll step through these rather quickly, and we'll get into the policy areas of rate strategy and rate policy in a moment. Similar graphs you'll see here, bar chart showing just customer counts, the number of customers on the system, and consumption. The story is a little bit flipped on electric as opposed to water. You can see here that the number of accounts or the number of meters on the system dominated by the residential customer class and the water side. Commercial customers, 1/10 of what it is almost, or roughly 1/10, 1/8 of what it is for the residential side, just a number of customers. Now, instead of looking at the number of meters, we look at the consumption, and we see that, that teeter totter split. We see much more energy or electricity consumptions on the commercial side than in residential. While we have almost an 8-to-1, 10-to-1 number in residential, majority, roughly 60-40 is consumed on the commercial side as far as the energy. So you can see how that balance is on the side of the commercial consumption. This looks at revenue, similar trends as far as overall consumption. We see similar trends on the residential commercial side, approaching roughly 50-50, a little under 50-50 from a revenue standpoint from residential and commercial. Understanding, it's something we'll get into much more detail, and we'll see here a little bit more on the policy side. The way in which customers use electricity on the system varies. That impacts what the bill looks like and what your rates and pricing signals look like. Thus, what a commercial customer uses and what their rate effectively is going to be different than an industrial or a small commercial or residential or agriculture. So depending on the type of customer and how they use the system, the rates vary. And that's reflected in these total revenue numbers. I think this may be the last slide before we get into some of the policy, or transitioning into more of the policy stuff and overall cost of service. Similar slide into water and wastewater, just electric customers and trends. I alluded to this a little bit on the slide. We talked about on the electricity market and the energy market in the country, how we're seeing less and less consumption overall, typically, or on average across utilities in the United States. It's a different story in the Broncos and other parts of Texas where there still is material growth on the system. Whereas even as things get more efficient, there's enough growth of customers coming to the system. You can see that they're reflected in the energy consumption over time That's the blue line in residential. You can see the residential customers going up, also the consumption going up. Oftentimes what we see is there's going to be minor growth on customer counts, but we're seeing flat to even declining consumption on the electric side in other parts of the country. Similar story for commercial and the other accounts. More moderate growth, but still growth, which is a good thing for the utility, if that growth is similar to what's on the system and is an efficient use of the system. That's something else that we'll get into in the cost of service. As the customers come to the system, if they use power or use electricity different than the current customers and they use it more efficiently, growth is a great benefit. But growth with a lot of customers, very little consumption, actually causes and exacerbates a lot of problems. So we don't have the amount of commodity to spread those costs over. So it actually causes more of a problem on the system. Any questions on the consumption side? We're just gonna have the trends are for MBU, a little bit different for MBU in Texas versus the rest of the country. Okay. With that, I think I'll turn it back to Rich for the revenue requirements, and then we'll get into policy discussion.
Thank you, Tony. The second part, tells you we're gonna look at the revenues, what the expectations were. We talked about that. We talked about customers. We talked about what their usage was and the revenues produced from that. So we'll do the same thing. Then we're projecting that out. We'll project out their customers. We'll project out their usage, and thus we'll project out the revenues. The reason we're doing that is so we can compare that against the revenue requirements. So remember, we're here to provide a service. This is the components that it takes to do that. The capital side of it, the infrastructure that it takes to provide that service to water, wastewater, electric, and then the operating side, what it takes to keep that going, keep it operating. And from a revenue requirement standpoint, a few components there. We talked about O&M expenses. You have your debt service, capital improvement side, there's taxes, contribution to revenues, different components there. Don't overcomplicate it right now. These are just what it takes to operate the system and provide that service. So that's what we're trying to accomplish here. When we move into this to our next meeting, that's what we'll bring to you and we'll look at as well. So here, as I said, don't overcomplicate it. It's as simple as we're going to project out the revenue in this process. We're going to project out the revenue requirements. What's it take to operate? Is there a gap? The plus or minus? Do we have enough revenues projected out, or do we not have enough revenues to operate the system for, like I said, next 3 years? That's what we're looking at for this. Will be for the next 3-year period. We already have 23. We'll look at 24, 25, and 26 in this process. Then here, the next thing we want to talk about is really your rate strategies, your policies. You asked the question earlier, Jonathan, do you have policies in place for some of the things? There are a lot of policies in place. You don't necessarily cover them all. Things we're going to talk about here, look at it from two sides. We're going to talk about things that Tony and I, MBU, that we come into often in doing this. Almost doesn't matter what the system is, what the city is. You deal with the same things. So some of these are going to jump to the forefront. And then how does MBU deal with these? So we're going to share both sides of that with you. Please ask questions on this one. But we just want to go through the process, make sure you understand why these are important. What you will find, because as we go through, and I told you we can get to the answer, we know what the number might be. There are a lot of ways to apply that. When you do these policies, you may say, oh, we just want to make sure this happens. Well, that may be opposite from this other policy that you wanted in place as well. So this is where we're going to have to blend it, but we'll talk about all of this. These are probably the key policy areas, the common things that we see coming up on every one of these studies. Your low fixed income customers, without a doubt, this is one of the biggest hotspots that comes out of this whole process is how do you deal with that? How do you work through this process? And how do you work them into the mix? Equity and fairness in rate making. Is everyone paying what they should be paying? Conservation, renewables, revenue sufficiency, how are we addressing growth? Then are we keeping what is our approach to keeping the utility stable, financially stable? And then whatever we recommend, is it something that's easy to understand? From a low fixed income customer standpoint, when we look at this, we want to look at not only okay, you have your low fixed income customers, what's the community standpoint on this? And this is part of why you're here too. We wanna know what the community standpoint on this is, and we have a breadth of people across the community here to cover all the different aspects, and that's what we're looking for on this, you know. How do we do this? How do we address those customers from a monetary standpoint? How should the utility be helping or not those customers? And how do we address that? Do we try to do it through rates? Do we do it through internal programs, external programs? What's the process for that? So,
Currently, there's no, well, I know there's programs, but there's no rate difference between fixed income, lower income compared to the rest.
yes, sir.
And that's one of the things that we want to contemplate in this process.
That's right. Absolutely, and I can tell you too that although there's not any kind of special rate, when we have had rate design over the last 3 years, and each year, what we tried to, actually it's been 4 years, I think, what we tried to accomplish on the water side at least was that lowest essential use, really focused on that and making sure that it stays affordable. So when you see the ranking at some point, it's very, very low compared to the rest.
Should not. We were gonna try to do something really fancy, so originally we were gonna go back and forth. Maybe I'll just speak, if I can speak loud enough. So, as Rich introduces these, we wanted to give you a context of what MDU is doing within the utility currently. And also, Rich and I can give you some color commentary on how this aligns with industry best practices. So as we kind of walk through these policies and strategies within the rate setting practice, the rate setting strategies and policies, we'll tell you what we see across the country in Texas. And so we'll show you here, this is the MDU approach currently with low-income customers. The two things I want to draw your attention to, there's a low-income discount. Well, it's not a rate, there is a discount for low-income customers. So if you're meeting certain criteria, 125% of the federal poverty level, if you meet certain criteria, you'll get that discount on your bill. In addition to the discount, you'll get an opportunity to also get additional assistance on the bill. So you get the discount, and on top of that, you get assistance. The program, if you want to get very specifics, we can, you speak to it, but the program, the intent is a lot of help up front to help reduce it over time to get you to a point where you pay the bill on your own.
So since MDU is a not-for-profit organization, if you're giving a subsidy or a discount, where are you making up for that since we're not?
It's in that revenue requirement, total costs incurred. This is, so it's a little bit longer discussion, but the costs are being incurred across the system. So those costs are being recovered in the retail rates. They're being essentially set aside, or there's a program set aside, the dollar amount in it, that then goes into the low-income discount and the assistance. The other point I want to draw your attention to is managed by a third party, not managed by MDU. So the money set aside by MDU then transfer to an organization that has a much better understanding of that community than necessarily MDU. It does it on a regular basis for a number of other things. I will say that in my opinion, is a better structure for utilities. Having utilities constantly monitoring 125% or 150%, whatever level is of poverty, making sure these people qualify, that's much better handled by an organization that does it on a regular basis, more efficient. Plus, they have the touch with those customers more often, typically than utilities, so they can have their hands on where that need is in the community and have that feel. So those two things, these are, I would say certainly, the percent of the poverty level, those criteria that are used, extremely common across the country, across Texas, as far as meeting those criteria. Being managed by a third party, in my opinion, is a very good practice. It makes the program more effective, reach those customers a little better, it makes them better. But to your point, Mark, on where does that money come from? That's often, when we've done these in the past, that's typically been seen as a community support item. So the community's behind it. We supporting disadvantaged or low-income customers. They're down a lot, have some issues, so we contribute to it.
I understand, and I agree with that, and I sympathize and certainly want to participate in doing that. But so the point I'm trying to get to is if you're selling MDU electricity at so much, at $1 a kilowatt, and we're just passing it on to our customers, well, if we're gonna discount it, then we have to charge the other customers
me say something else, the low income discount program, this is very, very new. We just started this,
2 years ago.
thank you, Dawn. Dawn has answered every question. We just started that 2 years ago, and you can see, you might be looking at going $3 a month, is that really doing anything? I know it's low, and the idea was, let's start out with something, let's just put something in place, and we try to model it after, programs and some utilities that have had great success with it. And so the idea behind that was to grow that discount and how we can, and its sophistication over time. So what you're seeing is the entry level effort that we created, but there, I think we budgeted more.
Yeah, so, if you wanna flip to the next slide, this shows the amount that we annually budgeted for each of the programs.
Dawn's our CFO.
So $166,000 for the low income discount program, and then $250,000 for utility bill assistance. And that is a line item on our financial operating plan. So yes, those costs do go somewhere.
So that budget doesn't restrict you if there's a higher use, or does it?
If we run out of funds, then we have to, have we ever run out of funds?
We always come close because our fiscal year ends in July, and we try and utilize all the funds available. And July has high usage, so at the end of the year we have customers that with that high energy usage need assistance that might not normally.
I think that you got to the point where, because our fiscal year ends July 31st, if those funds ran out, and the food bank said we have more applicants, the funds have run out, we would internally, I'll tell you, my decision, what funds do we have available? The customers ask me, let's see what we do about that.
And we do evaluate that each year, when we go through our budgeting process to, see if we need to, increase that. And obviously with everything that's happened this year, I feel like we need to, increase those funds, so.
Those are, as we do these enrichment and these things for utilities, engage stakeholders in the community, feedback on, do we wanna set aside a certain amount, or do we wanna meet the needs in the community? Those type of discussions, we want to provide feedback. Very common and typical responses. We're there to meet, create the program, and meet some needs, if we run out, we'll look at funds to meet.
When you do it the way that they do it now, that you guys it now, something pointed out, they're moving dollars, but that is a line item, dollar amount, $416,000. So that $416,000, same as, here's the amount we need to pay our electric bill. Here's the amount we're moving to we're allocating for low-income customers. And then that spreads from a recovery standpoint, that is gonna go out to all the customer classes. So that's who's paying for it, everybody, because that $416,000, the recovery is spread out to everybody. So that's how you recover it, because as Ian mentioned, zero-sum game. You still have to collect the dollars at the end of the day. On this, as Tony mentioned, much more favorable, we both are from the standpoint of doing it externally like this. The other option, trying to do it internally from a rate standpoint, I can't determine when I'm designing rates who's making how much money. I don't know. That 0 to 6,000 number that we're looking at, say that's the first tier, I don't know if that's a low income person. I don't know if that's somebody an attorney who lives by himself and is doing just fine, but he's home to bathe and sleep, and that's all he or she does. So, low usage, not low income, as Ian mentioned earlier, some of those, that two family that's living together, well, they blow right through that first block. It could be low income, but doesn't mean they were low usage. You can't design rates to specifically do that, but what you can do, as Ian mentioned, you can motivate that if you can stay in this block, you can save and you can impact your bill, whatever that might be. So,
Well,
that's,
the food bank, they're the experts in fall farming.
that's it. Yes, sir.
And they can track it and.
They have a whole array of programs, they're fantastic.
That's just letting the people do what they do best.
And the other portion is like, what's the funding level or impact the community? Getting the food bank, they've got the touch, but also communicating to make sure people know that those programs are there, and food bank has that access.
The next one, equity and fairness in the rate making. Do the rates fully align with what the results of the study is from a cost of service standpoint? Remember we said we would go through here, this is how much we have to recover. who do we recover that from? Who's creating that cost? We have a lump sum amount. Who's creating that cost from the customer classes? So that's what we'll do in the cost of service standpoint. And then we have to decide at the end of that, okay, do we recover exactly like the cost of service says? You know, residential should be paying this much, so that's what we're gonna do with our rate, design it. Or are there other things we need to take into account here? Is it gonna be too big? And you know, the third bullet there talks about if there's a larger rate increase, do we ramp into that? Same thing, or do we look at the subsidizing? Is it gonna be too big of a jump to get us back on track from a full cost recovery standpoint? And maybe it's growth. Maybe something was added that we weren't expecting. Doesn't take much for the system to get out of line from changing from 1 year to the next or 2 years to the next, but the last time this was done to now. Growth just impacts that, and the type of growth. If it grew different than what you expected, your cost recovery is gonna be different. So, do you fully align with that? Do you work up to that? Do you cross-subsidize with some till you get to where you want? It's a policy decision. But key to this is knowing where you're starting.
So from the standpoint of MDU, looking at the dreaded word subsidization, and we heard it early on, each MDU practices for each utility standalone, customer classes will align with cost of service. But what did we just decide on the slide earlier? Subsidizing one class, subsidizing, it is subsidization of low income. However, what's important in these is if we do decide to make these decisions, or the utility does, transparent, we know where it is, the line item. We're deciding that this is community value, something we're investing in, something we're doing, and you can see why we're doing it, it's reasonable. In general,
Expected, your cost recovery is gonna be different. So, do you fully align with that? Do you work up to that? Do you cross-subsidize with some till you get to where you want? It's a policy decision. But key to this is knowing where you're starting.
so from the standpoint of MDU, looking at the dreaded word subsidization, and we heard it early on, each MDU practices for each utility standalone, customer classes will align with cost of service. But what did we just decide on the slide earlier? Subsidizing one class, subsidizing, it is subsidization of low income. However, what's important in these is if we do decide to make these decisions, or the utility does, transparent, we know where it is, the line item. We're deciding that this is community value, something we're investing in, something we're doing, and you can see why we're doing it, it's reasonable. In general, as we move out of low income, where we want to do something specific, looking at each customer class, like water, sewer, electric, just the enterprises, the food enterprises, to have them standalone. Look at the customer classes and have them align with their costs. As the second, or I think it was the third bullet, I think on the first slide, gradualism. Often, every cost of service effort always shows things are out of whack. I've never been involved on that. I will assume Rich has never been involved on that, where we get the results, everything's perfect. Every class is perfect, don't need to change a thing. So there's always movement between the classes. So when we see that, we use some judgment and some practical approaches of how much movement is there. Do we do that gradually over time to allow those customer classes to adjust to how things are changing? So we get those pricing signals, have some time to have a lead in to have those changes over time so they can adjust. That's where gradualism comes into play. And that can come into play not only with how much of a rate change is happening just overall, but also with the structure of the rates. How much is in a base charge or a customer charge versus energy? How much demand or a minimum monthly bill versus commodity costs on the water side. So those changes can also be gradual over time as well, not just the overall bill. Those same tactics are used.
And the next part here from a policy standpoint, conservation and renewables. Renewable from renewable energy options, your sources. We talked about the different renewable energy options on the system. Conservation from a standpoint of pricing signals, like from a water standpoint. Do we make it more expensive to use more water? Do we hit a point to where you're in discretionary usage? You're no longer using what it takes to just operate in your family, if you would, bathing, eating, that type of thing. Now you're choosing to water, you're choosing to wash your car, you're choosing to do other things, okay? Discretionary usage. So do we give a conservation signal for that to where you can certainly do it, however, there's a cost to that. So these are additional decisions. that'll need to be made from there, and this is where we get into, we talk about the low income pricing, that kind of thing. Some of these go head to head with each other, they don't exactly work together.
And similar to the other slides, here's the MBU approach. The conservation renewables is an area, conservation has been around for a very, very long time. The kind of green rates, renewables on the electric side, that's, well, it's no longer emerging, it's right here in front of us, it's growing dramatically, the options and choices are growing, more competition in that space. As you heard earlier, for David, the DER, EVs, electric vehicles, DER being distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, and solar, rooftop solar. As MBU has stepped up and started to address this within their territory, coming up with their own DER strategy, that's currently underway and is a critical one. That's one where MBU is subject to a lot more things coming to them that they have a little less control over. They'll have to react to in some cases, but become more proactive with this strategy development in DER. Looking at conservation. Conservation can be seen in a couple different ways. The easiest, obviously, understanding conservation, implement tools or behaviors or technologies to use less, whether it's water or electricity, just use less overall. What's really critical in where the market is heading on the electric side, has been heading for quite some time, is when you're using electricity is the most critical thing. You could probably use as much as when it's, I don't know if you recall, but you said the market prices in ERCOT can vary between negative and positive. I don't know if anybody caught that, but sometimes you can be paid to take power from ERCOT. And that's because the wind's blowing and there's a tax credit. So they want you to take it. If they're not selling it, they can't get the tax credit. So when you can use as much as you want in the middle of the night, maybe when the wind's blowing like crazy, might not cost you anything. But in the middle of the day at 6 p.m. when everyone gets home in July, we've had 50 days of 100 degrees, it's a different story. That power, that electricity is much, much, much more expensive because we're running everything under the sun to try to reach that peak. ERCOT is dispatching everything. So the time in which you're using electricity is critical, the day and the hour. So that's a change in how things are being priced in the electric market. It's something that's been here for a while in some parts of the country, some regions. Something that I think is becoming much more of a standard and mandate across the country now, because that's really where the pricing signals are. So that's another element of conservation, not just using less in general, but what time of day are you using electric to it?
Let's throw another twist in, go ahead.
That doesn't affect the individual customer. For example, if I use a lot of electricity at night, I'm still gonna pay the same rate unless that I would if I used a lot of
Right
electricity.
now, yes, it's just, that's where those pricing signals come in. If I don't understand, if I don't have anything in my rate saying, there's seasonality, right, the summer, as you mentioned, like summer, we've got more power needs, that's where ERCOT meets its peak, obviously in Texas, it's hot, we use more electricity. In the non-summer months, those other 8 months, we don't use as much, it's more stable. We do see that seasonality, pricing differential, but right now, no, there's no, I pay 8 cents or whatever it is per every kilowatt hour, it doesn't matter when I use it. And that also with the number of electric vehicles coming to the grid, there's a chance to exacerbate a lot of the issues that we see in the electric consumption, electric profile consumption. So we want to target where people plug in EVs. It's super flexible. You only need like an hour charge, 2 hours at best, probably, on average for an electric vehicle for those that buy them every night. So should we plug it in at 6 p.m. when everyone's got electricity, their air conditioners running like crazy? Or should we have it, automate and charge itself at 2 a.m. in the morning?
You're bringing up a great point, because the cost of electricity is different times of day. But the rate that MU charges and most utilities charge is the same, right? There is an opportunity to create something called time and use rates. There's some use, not many, but some do. And with electric vehicles and distributed resources like that, that's something that would be interesting to talk about. At what point do we do that? Because it's an investment the utility need to make, but it also creates options and choices for customers. Initially, utility is what we want to do. I
country. The last statistic, we did a benchmarking study, and it was, I think, over half of municipal, we looked at municipal utilities like that we, over half of them had a time of use option. So a customer could choose that option if it benefited them or if they so chose it. In the western part, the western and southwest, state of Arizona has that time of use rate for 25 years. So they're not anything new. It's just the education around it. It's a lot easier to understand. I just use electricity, it's always the same price. So it's less customer education.
So typically it's presented as an option, much like you do like averaging over the.
Right, there's no averaging type of
Similar type of situation.
Similar type of idea, yeah, strategy behind it, it's provided as an option. One issue I will highlight, and it's changing, while it offers pilots or options, it's gain. So why am I gonna jump on a rate because I'm gonna benefit from it? So you're not targeting the people that are exacerbating your peak, so it's not really affecting what the goal was in developing the rate. So when it's offered like that, typically people can gain the system, oh, I see what I'm using, and I use less during the high price period, so I'm gonna jump on this. Unless it's mandated, which is where things are going, I'm sure hates the word mandate, but unless you get the vast majority of your system on it, over time, if you can't do that, it's not gonna change the behaviors that we need to see on the system to benefit all.
Is there any, you've got facilities that will track that?
We have the metering system that has the capability of doing that. And we would do some, if we implemented time of use, it wouldn't be next year, it would be something that we build out a plan in order to put in place. But we really need to look at, especially with proliferation of electric vehicles, oh man, I mean, if you look at the numbers the auto manufacturers are saying, that is a lot of folks coming home and plugging in 10 years. And if you want to incentivize folks not to plug in when energy is really, really expensive in our economy, we want to do it when wind is negative and rain is high, right? And maybe you have some type of incentive where here's a timer, so you plug it in, it'll turn on to a, whatever that you're talking about. I think there's just a lot of neat opportunities we can explore with time use.
So what happens when you increase that demand during those optimum times to the point where it becomes?
Yeah, it goes back to that discussion earlier about our load forecast, right? It's exactly what
There's a lot of room, so there's a big valley.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of room, and it's typically small charging, but it'll hit instantly, or not instantly, over a couple hours. So there's a lot of opportunity there before we get into the, looking at, oh my gosh, we created a week. But that can come, and that's actually happening in California. Their off-peak prices are higher than on.
Ian, what do you say?
I mean, this plays into a lot of the conservation model. And, I mean, I think the issue here would be, again, the education piece is educating the consumer on how to take advantage of that kind of program. Yeah, it's not looking at that.
Sit down here.
And the other part in this pricing component, it plays into the conservation side, it plays into the low-income side, trying to impact those, is when we design rates, there are two components to it. There's a fixed cost component and a variable component. Fixed cost, no matter what happens at home, you're paying your mortgage, you're paying your car payments, there are certain things that have to be done. Same thing on the system here, there are certain things that have to be paid, salaries, your debt service, or your infrastructure. All those things have to be paid. Unfortunately, that's the larger part of your system cost, or those fixed costs. So you have a smaller variable cost that changes and is impacted with what you use. Well, all the things you're talking about here, conservation, you have the ability to impact what you use, but if you size it based on what the results should be, well, that's a really small part that can really impact anything. So if you make that, if you price it, which I've never seen done, I've never seen a pure pricing for fixed and pricing for variable, because they're so skewed. Maybe 60-40, 70-30, it depends on your debt mix for your system. So that fixed cost component is large. If you make it so big, you don't really have anything left to incentivize people.
Can I say something, just a time check, it's about 10 till 5, I want to be respectful of y'all's time, so if you've got commitments, certainly, maybe we can step up a little bit.
Okay, the next thing we look at then is just two things, revenue sufficiency. First and foremost, does any of you go ahead and set the rates to fully recover? And if the answer is no, something has to drop. You know, either we don't build something, or we don't keep up the system, we don't hire, that type of thing. So those are decisions that have to be made there. If it's not the fully fund for the projection, you know, you either have to tell growth, no, not here, whether it's industrial, commercial, residential, can't handle you, or we're not updating the system, whatever that might be. So decisions to be made there. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong, those are just decisions, policy decisions. And then how do we accommodate growth? Ian mentioned earlier, the impact fees, and some people are intimately familiar with that here. So that's a policy decision. You know, does growth, do the new customers come in, pay for their growth, or does the whole system bear that burden? And do we adjust the rates to provide some kind of incentive for people to come in?
And as the others of you approach on revenue sufficiency, you know, and obviously it seems like a no-brainer. Yeah, you gotta recover your costs, you're not gonna get business. There are conditions though in which we're sometimes not fully recovering our costs, or potentially more recover just consumption. Really hot summer, or really dry summer, and really hot and really dry summer, or a really wet summer, people aren't watering. So sometimes those revenue streams can be a little bit lumpy depending on what's going on in the summer, and sometimes in the winter. Obviously, winter storm Uri is a whole other story. As those things become more frequent. So if there is some volatility on the revenue side and how to balance out the costs, what MU does is look at the capital program, look at other opportunities to manage or shift things around, which is again a very common approach to managing that revenue sufficiency, making the revenues meet those costs that are happening. On accommodating growth, this is another one that we will look at oftentimes in regards to subsidization. So similar to low income, there are some communities that are very much wanting to incentivize growth. I don't think there's a whole lot of need to go incentivizing more growth in the process. So do we want to have the new customer that comes to the system pay for that infrastructure that they're imposing on the system right away? Or is that something that the utility would take on? So in MBU's case, you're going to pay your own way. So as a developer, as new customers come to the system, that incremental new cost, or the cost to get to that new customer meter, or what the costs are on the system, that's going to be recovered from that growth. So those are the two sides of the coin that you can look at as far as funding growth or accommodating. Some utilities go the opposite direction and say, we're going to lay out the money for it, maybe we'll fund it too over time, but we're going to incentivize that growth. Whereas an MDU will fund it up front. I'm very much in support of MDU's approach. It's much more financially viable and stable for the utility, and it's better practice and more industry practice in my experience.
Now, next policy is from the utility, just the financial stability and strength. You know, decisions to be making there, these are really indicators and the factors that the utility is going to put into place. Things like the cash reserves, their debt service coverages, making sure there's sufficient revenue in there to meet all their debt at a certain level. Things like that, things like creating reserve funds. For instance, your wet time, where you're not selling water. That means revenues drop. So creating a fund there to help accommodate that at whatever time of year it be, whatever year that might be, you know, those are decisions. Because then you have a decision: do I create the fund? What level do I fund it? So when we're talking about this, these are decisions that we're trying to make from a utility, just a standpoint from the street-wise.
And again, the MDU approach to that financial stability and strength. What I'll say, this first bullet is extremely important. In maintaining bond covenants, so when MDU or any utility or city issues bonds, especially in a utility where it's a revenue-based bond, there's bond covenants that must maintain. So, people buying bonds and the bond rating agencies, like Fitch and S&P, they're looking at many different metrics and how the utility operates financially, and what rates they have in place, and mechanisms they have in place to recover costs, to then rate those bonds. Depending on the rating of the bond, your bond costs can go up, your debt costs can go up, your debt costs can go down. So the more financially stable and solid the utility is, the more mechanisms that are in place for the utility to manage volatility and things like that, the lower the debt issuance costs are. So that saves everyone money, saves utilities, saves everyone money. So there's covenants that are built into that bond that the rating agencies will look at, things like debt service coverage levels, specific covenants must be met, and above and beyond the bond covenants, many times utilities have other policies in place or expand them to ensure that financial stability and success. And so these, you can see a few of them listed here: debt service coverage, debt to cap is debt to capital. That's a balance of how much debt are we using versus how much cash funding. Debt spreads out costs over time, but if you get over leveraged with debt, you don't have any really room to move, and you aren't recovering all your costs from the fund system. So we're funding it from rates, from annual revenues from rates, or we funding it and spreading it out over time with debt. DCOH is days cash on hand, created in 140 days. Again, a very common metric. Think of that as your savings account. That's the number of days they have on cash they have available reserves to help balance the fluctuations and volatility in the market. Reserve funds, you can see a number of these. Contingency fund, many utilities have multiple different types of reserves, or contingency funds, or storm reserve funds, or many others, depending on the part of the country you're in. I just had a conversation with the utility that's right in the middle of Tornado Alley. They're setting up a storm reserve fund specifically for that. Things like floods and tornadoes that are going to impact their system. They want something specifically for us so they can respond to it when the time comes. The last bullet here, other variables that use transport. We talked about that fixed and variable balance. That's another metric that's viewed by the rating agencies and looked at for financial sustainability and stability. Fixed cost to operate utilities, it's worse so in water than it is electric in Texas, but it's about 50-50, 60-40 in Texas. For an electric utility like NPU to operate, 50 to 60% of your costs are fixed. Doesn't matter if you use 0 kilowatt hours or 1 million kilowatt hours, that cost is there. So how do we recover those costs? Do we recover them equitably in a fixed charge, or do we recover them in a variable charge and that balance? That's what the proposal look at. And finally, affordability, far from least. Affordability, which is top of mind for many folks, especially these days, inflationary nature of our country right now. What's the affordability of the water, sewer, and electric rates? How do you stack up from benchmarks?
So is there a bond policy when you,
Bond
when you, not the bond covenants, but when you borrow versus when you just, pass a rate along to the customers, or?
He's asking, his question.
A number of these, contingency fund, many utilities have multiple different types of reserves, or contingency funds, or storm reserve funds, or many others, depending on the part of the country you're in. I just had a conversation with the utility that's right in the middle of Tornado Alley. They're setting up a storm reserve fund specifically for that. Things like floods and tornadoes that are going to impact their system. They want something specifically for us so they can respond to it when the time comes. The last bullet here, other variables that use transport. We talked about that fixed and variable balance. That's another metric that's viewed by the rating agencies and looked at for financial sustainability and stability. Fixed cost to operate utilities, it's worse so in water than it is electric in Texas, but it's about 50-50, 60-40 in Texas. For an electric utility like NPU to operate, 50 to 60% of your costs are fixed. Doesn't matter if you use 0 kilowatt hours or 1 million kilowatt hours, that cost is there. So how do we recover those costs? Do we recover them equitably in a fixed charge, or do we recover them in a variable charge and that balance? That's what the proposal look at. And finally, affordability, far from least. Affordability, which is top of mind for many folks, especially these days, inflationary nature of our country right now. What's the affordability of the water, sewer, and electric rates? How do you stack up from benchmarks?
So is there a bond policy when you,
Bond
when you, not the bond covenants, but when you borrow versus when you just, pass a rate along to the customers, or?
He's asking, his question, if I understand you correctly, is when do we decide when you issue bonds or fund with cash, that type of thing? You want to point to because it's a pretty significant issue right now with the capital that we have and everything else.
Sure. So typically when we issue debt is we look at the life of the project. So any long-term project like a wastewater treatment plant, a water treatment plant, any of those we fund through debt. But then we also look at our measurement of how much debt we're issuing, because every year you're paying that principal principal and interest, and that rolls into the rates.
Okay, can I say, I think it's a really important question. So, the rating agencies look at all these ratios too, right? The total debt we're taking on, that it's represented in these ratios, and so that's part of what we're looking at as well. And the reason I'm talking about this is because one of the questions that came up in council the other night is how big should the reserve fund be, the power stabilization fund? You see 365 days there, that's due to what happened in Winter Storm Uri. We can talk more about that as time goes on. But the nature of your question is really important, because every year we put together our budget and our 5-year financial operating plan. Those are the exact questions that we're asking ourselves, and it goes to the heart of this rate design. I mean, really, at the end of the day, when you put the rate together, it's got to cover costs. At the same time, you've got to accomplish the strategy right here is to maintain stability, resiliency, and stability for your community-owned utility. Thanks, Tom.
And then last thing, we had talked about just the overall policies that we normally deal with on this rate design. How do we do it? Your rate should be simple to understand on this, simple enough that both MBU and the customers can understand it. And really, to say litmus test on this, can a customer go to the rates on the website and calculate their bill? It does not need to get any more complicated than that. If we've confused it enough that you can't figure out what your bill is, our rate's too complicated.
It's too complicated right now. It is. We need to fix it with this update. We will.
And then the other part, the pricing signals, they can conflict. We talked about earlier, versus market. If we're trying to help, say, low-income customers, and you're doing it through rates, but you do your fix so high that they really don't have any control over the rate, the rates conflict. Hot conservation, and we're giving hard conservation signals, but they still have to use certain amount, that's where the rates conflict. So that's kind of the balance, that's kind of playing with it back and forth, figuring out, not that they're not all important, but which one is more important and which one do we want to lean to.
Yeah, this is one that I think runs right into the, conversion right at, we're contradicting ourselves. We gotta balance it. Because as we just talked about in the electric market, we heard, we've got prices in the market going from negative to orders of magnitude higher than they normally are. So negative, $500 to, positive $5,000 megawatt. So it's that these prices can fluctuate wildly in the market. And so if we're trying to send those prices, this is electric, and if we're trying to send those signals so that we can optimize and make the system more efficient for the electric system, we need to pass some of those signals on to customers, but it is a little more difficult to understand. So one of the keys is that education that you talked about, having that lead time to educate and show them in a way that's simple to understand. Okay, we use power here, it's more expensive. We use power here, it's much, much less expensive. I can understand that, so I can adjust it. So this is one area that's across the country, in Texas, and it's just one that you have to strike a balance with rate.
And the other one seems fairly simple, but we really run into it all the time. Can you implement the rates you designed in the system, in the billing system currently? One example may be time of use.
We have the system to do that.
So we really have to take that into account. If you've never used it before, not necessarily the reason you should have planned ahead for that. So those are a few other things that we'll have to keep that in mind as we're going through this process. All of us here. So, and then really winding down, this is what we've got next. You've got your facilities tour coming up on the 16th. Then our next meeting here will be for September 14th. We mentioned to you, see here, review of projected revenues, review of revenue requirements, and then just where we stand. So that's what we will cover in this next meeting, and start feeding you real world information at that point. And that's it. Any questions or anything else?
In the interest of time, I would suggest that members of the rate advisory committee, if you've got questions that come to mind, email those to either Les or I, and we'll get you a reply on that. Those that are in the community, if you've got questions that you would like answers to, I would ask that you introduce yourself to Laura Rivers, she's right over here, after the meeting, and get her email address, so that you can submit those questions to her, and she can get you a reply as well. Real quick, Les and I had a couple things we just wanted to make sure we touched on as we closed out. And that's just to remind everybody that our purpose is to learn about the utility business and get educated on what's going on in our community together, to provide insight about rate structures and design to the MBU Board of Trustees and MBU management that reflects our community well. We want to make sure that we're providing transparency and ensure that rates are in line with the cost to provide service, and that the rate structures reflect New Braunfels community and MBU's values and objectives. I also want to make sure to remind everybody that what we're doing is providing input on the 2022-2023 cost of service and rate design study. So that is actually not going to see, you're not going to see the influence of that until rates that are applicable for 24, 25, and 26. Since June, as many of y'all know, Les and I have met with the majority of the committee to visit, to make sure everybody understood the value of your time and what we're doing here. And so I really appreciate that, as well as others that are not on the rate advisory committee. We've had some folks that have reached out and said, hey, I'd like to meet with someone. And so we've had a great time doing that with folks from the community that have wanted to have some conversation. In addition to those conversations, though, I do want to remind everybody that there are several members of this committee that are creating focus groups in their sphere of work, whatever type of work that they do, in an effort to elicit a broader set of citizens' input, and we're going to bring that to the committee at a later date. Another thing is the critical contribution of our deliberations as the Rate Advisory Committee is to provide input to members, provided by members to the New Braunfels community and to the committee at large in formal public meetings like this and through individual interactions and various members, with various members of the committee. So if you're having conversations with folks in your neighborhood, you need assistance, folks in your workplace, you need assistance, folks in the community that you run across, you need assistance, just let us know. And in all sincerity, the MBU Board of Trustees, MBU staff, and the rate committee, we welcome public input. We want public input. We're members of this community just like everybody else, and so, if we can have good public comment, we want constructive input. We want to engage you in dialogue and respectfully work together. I mean, we're all working toward a set of principles that reflect the values, the goals of our entire community. And so, if you feel like we don't, we want you to come and sit down with us. We want you to talk to us because we're learning as well how to make our community a better place going forward. One of the couple last few things, it's just been a lot of fun to work with each of you guys and gals that we've been able to meet with. We're trying to serve a community on this committee to develop a robust set of insights and perspectives that we can come to as a consensus. And so I really appreciate everybody's input on that. Really quickly, last thing, again, September 14th, 2022, at 3 p.m., we're going to have our next meeting over at the Civic Center. And just don't hesitate to give Les or I a call if we can help you, or if you got questions. We're definitely happy to work with MBU's executive team, Laura, whoever, to get everybody answers. And again, to those of you in the public that came today, thank you so much for coming on the 14th. Please come back. Please bring friends with you. We definitely want to consider everybody's input in this process, and to the Rate Advisory Committee for your time. I know it's a commitment to give of your time. I appreciate your long-standing commitment to this community, as well as your efforts to make it a good place to live, a good place to work, a good place to play, that others will enjoy in our future as well. So if there's nothing else with that, this meeting is adjourned.
one question real quick? We've got a couple thousand people streaming on here right now, many who could not be here because this meeting was held in the middle of the day and they work. And they were wondering whether or not you guys could have meetings where people who work could attend.
I would say we can definitely consider that. The reason that today's meeting was, at the time that it was, you know, we kind of took a poll of all the people on the rate advisory committee is, hey, when's the best time to meet? And so we came to a consensus that today we would do it at 2:30. But if that's a change that we can make, we can definitely look into that. We just gotta make sure we have a quorum because it's subject to the open meetings. And so it wasn't that MBU said, hey, let's have this meeting at 2:30 so nobody can attend. I know that some folks have commented in that regard. That wasn't it. That was us making a decision of when we can collectively get together. But I'll send a message out to the committee and see if there's a way we can either do it at a later hour so some people can attend, because like I said, we definitely want people's inputs. We want to do this together.
The only other issue about the streaming thing that we're doing right now, which we're live, is that we're gonna have to go back and explain what we learned from this. And I feel like I'm still not clear on what y'all are doing. And I know that the people watching are saying that in some of the comments about what you all feel your position is and what you are gonna be doing. And basically we just had a lesson. Again, there's a couple thousand people here, just so you know. We just had a lesson from NBU basically on, you know, Utilities 101, right? To this group, because I think the understanding is that nobody here has experience in that area. And so you're learning it so that then you can advise. That's correct? And it's gonna be some technical advising, correct?
No.
So there's no technical advising going on?
No, what we're trying to do is come up with a set of principles that reflect who we are as a community through means like meetings like this, learning about what they're doing at a very high level. We're not going to get involved in the calculations of the rates. And so, I want to be very clear.
Can you give me an example of what that is? Because again, we're dealing with people who are going, what does that mean? What does that mean that you're going to be advising at a very high level and telling about the community? Like, what specifically is that? I don't understand.
I would say we're learning at a very high level. We're not getting into the weeds of the day-to-day operations of the utility.
Yeah.
What we're doing is listening to the things that they have to present to us. We all serve various sectors of our community, and whether it's our jobs, nonprofits, religious organizations, neighborhoods. And so we're listening and trying to gather input to say, hey, look, when you guys go to set your rates, these are things that are important to this community. And I think if you would get with Laura and get her email, she might be able to share those last several screens. And I think that does a really good job of explaining what our purpose is. We're not freezing nickels. We're not Next Gen Strategies.
Good, that's good, because when we initially, especially a lot of people in the group, that was the thought process was, well, why are these people learning about utilities? They don't know anything about it. And what kind of value is this gonna give to the utility company? Like how is that gonna work? Because do we need to learn all of this stuff to go, hey, charge less to people who are poor and charge more to the new communities for infrastructure? And I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like, it seems common sense, and that's what people are asking.
So if you'd like to give me your information, I'll be happy to contact you directly, and we can sit down with you if you'd like to explain a little bit further.
That'd be great. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. Thanks.
And I would always encourage anybody, the best thing you can do is reach out to MBU, set up a meeting, go down there, ask questions, give them a chance to provide you information. There's nothing hidden here. We're 100% open book.
Do
This
you work
committee-
for NBU?
No.
No.
I have my own business.
Okay. I
But
just don't know how.
I'm a member of this community, and MBU is a member of this community. And so, yes, in that regard, I'm on the same team, because we're all living here, we all love community here. And so I would say we're all on the same team. So at the end of the day, this rate advisory committee wants them to bring this information so that we can learn more about it, so that when we give them feedback on how our community looks at these types of topics, it reflects us as a whole. But still, the best thing we can do, because I gotta get these folks out of here, the best thing that we can do is Lauren's gonna get her information to you, and communicate directly with them to get real, open, honest information, because when we make assumptions, we don't learn. And I wanna get you the information that you seek Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
So,
Well, and again, I'm just passing on stuff that other people are asking.
no, that's wonderful questions, I love them. Very good. And then hopefully next week, or next month, Les will be back with us, so thank you very much for being here.